Hey folks, welcome. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Elastic Beanstalk environment configurations. So we'll talk about how to configure environments in much more detail than previous lessons. Oftentimes, applications need other services like databases, caching, queues, a VPC. They may also require software dependencies or other specific configurations. So we need a way to configure our environment to provide everything the application needs, and we can do that using different configuration options. Now, most of our configuration options have defaults and are applied by Elastic Beanstalk, but oftentimes we need more control over these options. Therefore, we need a way to customize these options. So how can we do this? Well, we can use configuration files that we add to our source code bundle, and we would add these configuration files in the .eb extensions folder. We'll talk about this a bit later in the lesson. We can also use save configurations, which are configurations we save in Amazon S3, or we can just make direct changes to the environment with CLI tools, SDKs, or API calls. Now, in this lesson, we're going to focus on configuration files, but we'll talk about some of the other options as well. So what kind of configurations are we talking about? Well, there are deployment options, such as auto-scaling, CloudWatch settings. Talk about software configurations and dependencies, and bootstrapping in general. CloudWatch metrics and alarms, again, auto-scaling, and other service configurations. Now, we also need to create other resources for our application, such as RDS databases, SQS queues, SNS notifications. And here's a very key point. And we'll talk about this, but then we'll also illustrate it in the management console. Elastic Beanstalk uses CloudFormation under the hood, so to speak, to deploy environments and resources. So we have access to resource types and configurations supported by CloudFormation. So with that in mind, while we're going through the lesson, I'm going to go into the management console and I'm going to create a new environment. And I'll just select a web server environment, create a domain name, and I check for the availability. Now, platform, not terribly important. I just want to build an environment. I'm just going to select PHP, sample application, and create environment. All right, so this will take a few minutes to build. While this is building, let's just go back to the lesson. Now we're going to talk about configuration files, and these files can be added to the root of our application source bundle. And I keep going back to Java. And with Java, we'll have a war file. So we would have an EB extensions folder at the root level. And within that folder, we would add our config files. Now, the name of the config files don't really matter, although they are evaluated alphabetically. It just matters that they have the config extension. So when we want to customize our configurations, looking at our diagram, we would be working with these configuration files or saved configurations, which are stored in S3. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of these configuration files. Now, configuration files can contain multiple different sections, including option settings. And the option settings define values for configuration options. And I'm going to switch my split screen to a source code editor. So this is great timing. Our Elastic Beanstalk environment is built. Now, what I want to show and illustrate here is, let's go over to CloudFormation. And we have a stack. In building our Elastic Beanstalk environment, a CloudFormation stack was also built. And these stacks always have the prefix AWS EB. So again, under the hood of Elastic Beanstalk, CloudFormation is at work. Now, let's go to resources. And lo and behold, there are resources for this stack, but more importantly, for Elastic Beanstalk. Auto-scaling, Elastic Beanstalk, auto-scaling group, auto-scaling launch configuration, scaling policy, and on and on. Load balancer, security group. Now, let's click on Actions and click Update Stack. So I'm not going to go ahead and update this stack, but I just want to illustrate there's an underlying CloudFormation stack when we build an Elastic Beanstalk environment, and we can treat just like any other stack, including the ability to update it. And with that, I'm going to change my split screen. I'm going to bring up an editor. Okay, so I'm going to first look at an options.config file. Now again, the important points here, and important to remember for a certification exam, for the DevOps certification exam, is that at the root level of your software package, you're going to have a .eb extensions folder. And within that folder, you're going to have config files for Elastic Beanstalk. Now, a couple points I want to emphasize about customizing configurations for Elastic Beanstalk environments. You can set configure options before environment creation, but you can also set configuration options during environment creation or after environment creation. And there are some slight differences in ways you can change the configuration options. Setting configuration options before environment creation, you can use configuration files, which is what we're looking at right now, an options config file in .eb extensions folder. You can use saved configurations. You can also use a JSON document or the Elastic Beanstalk CLI configuration. Now, when you do it during environment creation, some of this can be done in the new environment wizard. So there's different ways to go about this and the timing of it before, during, or after environment configuration. But really the important thing to note is where this information is stored, again at the root level of your software bundle, in a folder known as .eb extensions. And we always want to think in terms of use cases. If you get a question on the exam related to custom configurations, updating configurations, you just want to start thinking about .eb extensions and the config files within that folder. All right, so let's take a look at this options config. And note this is in YAML format, can be JSON or YAML. So we have Elastic Beanstalk custom option. So in this file, we're going to specify certain keys and values. For example, the cache node type. And we want to set that to a T2 micro. Number of cache nodes is 1. Engine is Redis. Cache port is 6379. Visibility timeout is 30. Alarm email. And note this line. Application environment. We're actually setting an environment variable, and it's going to reference the AWS region from our environment, much like the ref intrinsic function in CloudFormation. This is surely looking familiar. We're setting some parameters for auto scaling, cooldown period, cooldown of 120, that's in seconds, scaling unit of percent, period, breach duration, upper threshold, lower threshold, measurement name, CPU utilization, so upper threshold of 75%, lower threshold of 30%. Now, in a moment, we'll see in a different config file a resources section, which lets us define and customize resources in our environment. And with resources, we can go a little bit further than we can with options settings. All right, so let's take a look at our elasticache.config file. So in this file, we're declaring our resources, my Elasticache, Elasticache cluster, also a security group resource, and also security group ingress. And you can see this is much like a CloudFormation template. A couple things I want to point out in here is this function get option setting, and you see it a few times. Well, remember, in our options config file, we have a cache node type. Let's go back over there. So these files are actually interacting with each other. This command is grabbing that cache node type of T2 micro. Now, if there's any problem with that whatsoever, there's a default value, and the default is M1 small. Likewise, again, function get option setting, num cache nodes, and here it is. Function get option setting, engine. And our engine is Redis. So that's how these files are interacting with each other and working to customize the Elastic Beanstalk configuration. Now you probably get the idea, but let's check out one more. Let's check out q.config. And I'll just say it one more time. All of these config files go in your .eb extensions folder at the root of your software package. So this is pretty straightforward now. So we're adding an SQSQ and setting up our resources. Of course, an SQSQ, we've seen this before, an SNS topic, Q depth alarm, a CloudWatch alarm. There's a lot going on in this little file. So we have an SQSQ, and it looks like we're going to have a CloudWatch alarm linked to an SNS topic. And we've seen that before. Somebody can subscribe to the topic and get email notifications. So let's see, we have a visibility timeout. We're using our handy function get option settings. And let's go over to options config. We're grabbing that visibility timeout. Here's another one. And remember, in options config, we set up an alarm email right here. And we have a default in case something goes awry. This is actually pretty straightforward. And let's look at one more. And then we're setting up our CloudWatch alarm. And the description tells all. Alarm if queue depth grows beyond 10 messages. So we're setting up our namespace. And there's our threshold of 10 messages. And then we have our alarm actions. And we're referring to the alarm topic. And note the output, very similar to what would be the output of a CloudFormation stack. URL of newly created SQSQ, the ARN of that queue, and also the name. So these config files in our EB extension directory will be executed when we deploy a new application version. So anytime we want to make changes, we have to either change these files or add new config files to the directory and then deploy a new application version. It's actually pretty straightforward. Now there can be other sections in these files. There can be command sections, container commands, files, groups, packages, services, sources, and users. Now these sections let us configure EC2 instances that are launched in our environment and host our application. So with these sections, we have actions to bootstrap our instances and get them ready to serve traffic. And you're probably noticing that you've seen these somewhere before, and that would be in CloudFormation init, CFN init file. All right, so that's custom configurations, but we can also create saved configurations. These are stored in Amazon S3. Now, these saved configurations can be used to save settings we've applied to an existing environment during or after environment creation. These saved configurations belong to an application, but they can be applied to new or existing environments for that application. And these are YAML formatted templates that define the environment's platform configuration, like whether it's single or multiple or multi-container Docker deployment. For example, the tier, remember when we create an environment, we select web server or worker tier. Let's say that we deploy an application in a new environment, and we want to save that environment along with its current state. We can save that as a document, and that's what a saved configuration is. So we could use this saved configuration to restore that environment to this specific point at a later date. We can also create a new environment. Basically, we have a restore point. Now, out of all of this, an important thing to note is the precedence to determine which configurations are applied. So, the order of precedence for configuration is direct changes have the highest precedence. Saved configurations have the next highest precedence. And finally, configuration files have the lowest precedence. So, as an example, a setting applied via a saved configuration has higher precedence than setting the same setting via configuration files. So that's a look at our configuration options for making changes to our Elastic Beanstalk environment. And key points for the exam is just know, again, that you have an EB extensions folder at the root level of your software package. You have config files within that folder. And also it's important to remember that the precedence of these configuration options. Direct changes have the highest preference, followed by saved configurations, followed by configuration files in your EB extensions folder. And with that, we have completed this lesson. Let's go ahead and mark this one complete, and let's move on to the next.